I think it's really important to think about what we want our schools to look like, what culture we want to promote. And, someone who grew up not in the US, in Greece, in a country which actually made it illegal for the police to even enter universities because there had been, real oppression. And, during our history, the Greek history, there was, a revolt against the dictatorship, and the police went into university and killed a lot of students. And that was the law for many years. I find it shocking that we're even having this conversation. So I just want to kind of broaden that out to say that having police in schools should be shocking. That isn't the right place.
A lot of the work that we did went into uncovering the history of the SRO program. And as you'll hear, this program was established very nearly under cover of night. We did a lot of work, particularly at Malcolm Cawthorn, to uncover the facts and the history behind this position. It seems to be the primary benefit of this program is to police and not to families. There's no evidence that SROs make students feel safer. And what we did find through the survey that Eitan was talking about earlier is that out of parents with children in schools, only 14% report that law enforcement officers are stationed in the school. 47% say officers are not stationed at the school, and 39% are not sure. So it's really troubling to the question of if this is meant to be building relationships with students and families, how well that's happening if the parents aren't even aware that this is occurring.
When did the SRO program start? And forgive me if you've already said that.
So that's a bit complicated, and it's official, like signed memorandum of understanding, not until February of 2019. However, in my opinion, there's been a lot of moving targets. That same SRO was already in the building in the fall of 2018, as well as we found out on the Monday before Thanksgiving that there wasn't one SRO, there are now 4 SROs. And we were wondering how that happened. We got a quick explanation from Officer Hatchett, or Sergeant Hatchett, sorry. And we got a quick explanation of that, but it wasn't fulfilling, I guess, for lack of a better term. It was more, well, they're already doing these in schools, and we kind of renamed the officers. That was the quick explanation.
State law no longer requires a school resource officer. They have put guidelines or requirements if you are going to have a school resource officer. I think in addition to this, the school committee never had an opportunity to weigh in as to whether or not we should do this, and if so, what an MOU between the school department and the police department should look like. Neither did the select board.
And just frankly, it's not really sure in my mind that they are following the memorandum of understanding and completing all the tasks that are expected of it. And those are the ones that are in the middle school, who flirt with 8 different schools, 6 through 8. They walk in armed, and obviously nobody's walking in now, but they walk in armed. What is that role, and who is actually benefiting from it? Because I think it's pretty clear, what ends up on the police website. I don't think it's really clear what that means for children and what that means for their caretakers. And so I think I was really, some of the stats that Eitan produced that was really compelling was around trust and perception and things of that nature by the adults who filled out the survey. And I wonder, if they knew all the other pieces, how that would, that number was a majority anyway, right? The police officers are teaching about healthy relationships to middle school kids. That's bizarre to me. And it's not like a police officer isn't capable of that, but what makes that police officer more trained to do that than a health and wellness teacher?
Malcolm, can I ask you what that meeting that sort of preceded the SRO meeting, were you able to capture sort of, not exactly what happened in that meeting, but the sentiments of the young people that were there in that meeting?
I think I'm carrying 2 hats with SRO. There's the committee work, which is more broad district-wide, but then also as the MECO coordinator at Brookline High School, we've been examining the role. One of the things that was really clear was many kids had no idea, not just that there was a school resource officer, but why there was a school resource officer. Towards the end, you just heard kids saying, why do we have one? Like I don't understand the need. And I don't mind sharing, when we surveyed parents in the fall from those 3 programs, 3/4 of the parents and adults and caretakers had no idea there was a school resource officer. I keep coming back to this. It's hard to say something is community oriented when most people don't know it exists. Right. If that's school children and adults, and frankly, teachers. There's a lot of school personnel who had no idea we had a school resource officer. It's hard to call that a community oriented thing.
What I don't want to sound, though, is defensive about our school resource officer. What I want to be really clear is that I own not communicating more fully about the school resource officer, the role to students, staff, and families. And so I believe it was Joanna Baker who spoke to this before, that when you're engaged in organizational design, you're better to do those things up front. Meaning think about the purpose of a role and to work with members of the community who might be more impacted by that role. And we didn't do that. And so just wanting to own that piece.
After collecting the data, right, if a statistical minority in our school community, including staff, which I want to include staff of color in, I think they should be surveyed as well in this because they are part of the school community having to interact and engage with the SROs. If a statistical minority feel unsafe because of this program, especially if those folks represent people coming from historically marginalized communities, it should not be considered a public safety measure. Public safety means all of us in the school community. And just because a majority of folks feel like safer because of that, let's critically look at who the majority is in our school building and what identities, dominant, oppressive identities folks may be coming from, and just really critically look at that before making any decisions.
We have to think about the atmosphere it creates for traditionally over-policed communities to have an officer permanently stationed in what is supposed to be a place of learning.
After hiatus, they've decided to continue the AWARE program, right? So the sort of the SRO function in the middle schools, at least is partly the way you can think about that, shifting the focus from health and wellness and cyberbullying to racial justice. So their plan, which as far as we can tell was not made in conjunction with any parents, folks found this out through an email to parents last week, that police will be in the schools teaching kids about racial justice, which is certainly a surprise and not something that I think is an appropriate use of police, or really the best that we can do to teach kids in Brookline about racial justice.
So I think it's an instance where we continue to see that the plan is murky, and parents finding out after the fact what the priorities are around use of policing resources in schools just feels a bit erratic. And I think part of what we're trying as a subcommittee to ensure, part of what we've called for is let's understand the breadth of what we propose to do and then decide who are the best resources to be able to deliver that. The choice to use police officers for the AWARE curriculum cannot be analyzed or thought about absent the context of how people experience the larger effects of policing in the community. So we might look at it as an independent program, but it's a network, an accumulative, an accretion for lots of folks in the community. And so I think it's particularly important that we look at that program in light of the full experience of policing and public safety in the town.
I can't even gather my thoughts around something like this. The idea that the police would take it upon themselves to teach about racial justice, and I can't even. I'll just say this is not something before a Brookline parent brought it to my attention. This change to the AWARE program is not something I became aware of either in our work here through the task force or as a select board member.
As a committee, we've struck a nerve somewhere because one of those SROs reached out to our MECO social worker to try and get more involved and build a partnership, which it didn't actually come to me. It went to my social worker. And luckily his instincts as an Egmont kid and a social worker kicked in to where he was like, yeah, partnerships are two-way streets. Because that's what we've been finding out. that and this is the third time since we started this committee, a police officer has gone to somebody else within the schools to say, hey, let's have conversation and create partnerships. And so, it's not that is inherently bad. It is the idea of who's that benefiting and what is the impetus behind reaching out. And I think, unfortunately, what a lot of our work has uncovered is it really is a one-way benefit and not a true partnership.
I just wanted to say, with respect to the hearing on the SRO, I did watch that. And one sense I got was that the folks, mostly from the school system, who were more supportive of the SRO, what it seemed like is that here was a person who was a resource, who was doing things. And what they were concerned about is if you remove that person, you don't have that FTE doing things. And what that argues for isn't necessarily keeping the SRO, but replacing them with another person to do things who would be more qualified to do those things.
We're saying it's really nice to have someone in the community floating in the building, I guess, someone who can build trust, but we want this person to have a racial equity lens. We'd like them to have a wellness lens. We'd like them to form relationships with the students and presumably the teachers. I don't see what makes an officer on the police department particularly well suited to that function. So I would ask, what's the function that we're trying to, that we want to preserve? It doesn't seem that people from the schools have requested this. And so who is this serving? And as someone who taught at Brookline for 45 years, I never, ever, ever felt the need, it would not have occurred to me to call the police. Why? Because I have a relationship with my students. I'm going to be much better if they're getting agitated. A teacher or a guidance counselor or an administrator, someone who knows the student well, it's going to be much more effective at diffusing. The police coming in, what are they going to do? I mean, how can they do anything but amplify, the tension? So no one so far, and Marcy, I think you did a great job trying, but no one so far has convinced me that there is really any reason to have an SRO in the school.
I think people can admit is true that, the people currently in the roles for I believe Caitlin at at the high school, Caitlin seems like a good person who really cares about the students and thing, but that has to be separated from the fact that you still have a position of a police officer in the schools. And what does that say? Why did that arrangement come about? The things Caitlin is doing, because she seems to be a good person who generally cares about the students, the functions and the roles she occupies are not they're things that a different profession could do and maybe even be better suited to do.
We can't think about it as an individual. We have to think about it as a system. And that was part of what the material said, and there are studies out there that say that, even if kids do end up getting in trouble, because there's an SRO there, they're more likely to end up in the criminal justice system.
Now, it sounds to me that the person that we have is a really good person. And it's difficult sometimes to distinguish and to have a conversation about roles, about systems, when you actually like the person and they're actually doing something that's useful. It's useful to the teachers, it's useful to, the counselors. So somehow I think it would be useful to write down what are those duties and then reimagine. I mean, this is the task that you have ahead of how we can do it without creating it to fall under the police.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of the feedback that I caught too, is the taking an officer out of uniform and not having having them leave their gun at home or at the office, and those kinds of things. All it's starting from a position of an officer needs to be there, and sort of trying to fit that officer, that square peg, into a circular hole, which is someone that can provide the kinds of resources and supports that everyone I think agrees are necessary and that we don't have enough of for young people. Rather than be able to say, okay, clearly those resources are needed. Let's start. If we built from the ground up and said, how are we best going to address these resources? We probably wouldn't arrive at having a police officer do it. We'd arrive at some different conclusion.
We are now adding in the formal recommendation that school resource officers not be in schools, and that is our first and primary recommendation. Previously, we had said it, hey, listen, if you want school resource officers to stay in schools, here's the public process that needs to be done. That is all still there, but it is very much secondary now to our point. Get them out of there. And to the extent to which you want to keep them there, they should be out now and only brought back in if at the end of a long public process, that is what you're determined to do. And we strengthen our language there to make it clear that we're not saying, okay, dismiss our main recommendation and move immediately to the public process. This is what we believe after months of careful consideration and talking to a lot of people and really bringing in the history.
Are we actually asking a school resource officer to do what is defined by the memorandum of understanding and law? And so, our feeling was that is not happening. That the things that, are prescribed by that memorandum of understanding as well as prescribed by law as an SRO is not happening. It's definitely not happening in the middle schools. And even at the high school, when I was saying, have stronger language. We don't believe there's a need for a school resource officer in Brookline.
Whether this happens in Brookline or not, there's a public perception in many places where there are police officers in schools that the point of the officer being there is for situations where student misconduct exists for it to be transferred into the criminal system, right? So like this is the, I'm gonna, like my soapbox that I've been saying before, everybody in this meeting has committed a criminal act within the last year. Absolutely everybody. That is the way the criminal legal system works. That's the way it's designed to work, such that it comes down to a matter of police discretion, whether you're brought into the court system or not, and whether you're arrested or not, right? Mountains can be made out of molehills and vice versa. And the problem with this that can result from this, right, is like I went to a high school where if one kid punched another in the hallway, he went to the principal's office. But there are high schools in this country where if one kid punches another in the hallway and the cop who's standing in the hallway on duty sees it, that kid is going to court the next day, right? And then me, eventually, or one of my colleagues is standing up there defending him.
There are alternatives out there. And I think that, as you all are saying, that it's important to begin to explore them and to actually use data.
My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a social worker at BHS. I do feel very strongly about the importance of building more restorative culture in schools, not just as an alternative to more punitive culture, which is, often propagated by having police in schools. Perhaps instead of having SROs, we could have restorative justice liaisons who can, who can really build a better community for all of us, even in a community building way, not just in response to harm being done to others.